So I'll start talking a little bit. I'm Donna Berman. I'm the Executive Director of the Charter Oak Cultural Center. And we've been doing Charter Oak Chats, I think since April maybe. And it's a Thursday night group. We get together at 6:30 and we read poetry or we read an essay and we discuss it. And we've had just a really wonderful time. As I say every week, there's nothing as delicious as looking at a piece of art or reading a piece of literature and really chewing it over with people. And so it's been absolutely a delight. And we have something really, really, really special tonight. We are, if you notice, I keep looking over here because people are entering. I have to do two things at once. I can barely do one thing at once. I have to keep letting people in. We have partnered with the New Britain Museum of American Art, one of my favorite institutions in the greater Hartford area. We're so honored to partner with them. And so we have with us Lisa Williams from the library and Marisa Williamson from University of Hartford. She's an artist and a scholar. I'm going to be introducing Marisa later, but I'm going to be introducing Lisa first because this is what the evening's going to be. It's going to be, we're going to have a virtual tour of the Kara Walker exhibit, and that's now being exhibited at the museum. And then we're going to talk about this amazing article by Zadie Smith. And Marisa is going to present on it, and then we're going to talk about the article. So I hope, what I think is it's going to really feed us. This is going to be a really, really nourishing night that we're going to share together. And Lisa and Marisa and I are really very excited to be with you. So I want to, from the bottom of my heart, I want to welcome you. And normally on Thursday nights for Charter Oak Chatter, we just kind of start off with a little check-in if anybody has anything that they want to share. These have been such hard times, so much pain, and just want to kind of ground our discussion in the reality that we're living in. So if anyone wants to share, I want to welcome you to do that. Okay, it's a quiet group tonight. It might be because you're all muted, huh?
I'd like to share. I want to thank you for this because I'm very unhappy I couldn't get into the New Britain Museum to see this show focus on women artists, and especially this artist who is like a railroad spike in a long line of ignorance. She really plunged American art to reckon, plunged a stake into the stakes at hand in American art in general. So I feel actually grateful to have a chance to do this. So thank you, whoever got this together, because I've been pissed I couldn't get in there myself.
All right, Margaret, don't hold back.
So I even put on my glasses,
Oh.
So thank you very much before anything else goes. Thanks.
You're very welcome. You're very welcome. Thank you for coming.
I say ditto, and I also much gratitude to all three of you because I feel the same way as Margaret. I was really sorry that I wasn't going to get to see the exhibit in person, so I'm very happy to be here tonight. Thank you.
We're very happy you're here too. Thank you. Anyone else? I can't see anybody. I think you can use your hand, putting your hand up symbol. And I don't see anybody. Am I missing someone? No? Okay. So I'm going to introduce Lisa Williams from the New Britain Museum of American Art. And it's my pleasure to do this. She's going to actually talk to us. She's going to contextualize the virtual tour that we're going to see of Kara Walker's Harper's Pictorial History of the Civil War, Annotated. Lisa has served as the Associate Curator at the New Britain Museum of American Art for the past 4 years. She worked closely on the conception and curation of numerous special exhibits as part of the museum's 2020 20 Plus. Is that how you say it? Lisa?
Yep, got it right.
Women at the New Britain Museum of American Art initiative dedicated to bringing greater representation to women artists. She's currently at work on an exhibition entitled Someday is Now, Women, Art, and Social Change, celebrating the centennial of women's suffrage and scheduled to open in the fall of 2020. Please God, we'll all get to go and see it. Williams received a BA in studio art and art history at Boston College and an MA in modern art, critical and curatorial studies from Columbia University. And again, it's my pleasure to introduce Lisa Williams. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Donna. Can you hear me okay? Audio and video is okay. Okay, great. Donna, thank you so much for conceiving of this program. I credit you for coming to us with the idea to talk about this incredible Zadie Smith essay in the context of the Kara Walker show. And I'm so glad that after lots of discussion, this is coming to fruition. I could not be more excited. And this is really what we want to come out of exhibitions. We don't want the exhibitions to just be on the wall, static, to be received passively. We want them to spark conversation. So thank you for making that happen. Marisa, I was so excited to meet you earlier this year, and I've wanted to have an opportunity to collaborate, and I hope this is the first of many collaborations that we can undertake together. So I'm so excited. I'll talk for about 5 minutes. I'll keep it pretty quick. As Donna mentioned, I'm going to introduce a video walkthrough of our current exhibition at the New Britain Museum of American Art entitled Kara Walker, Harper's Pictorial History of the Civil War, Annotated. As we begin to think about when we're going to reopen the museum, it's with the intention of extending the show. So while the show was scheduled to come down in April, it's still up in the museum right now. So we're hoping that we'll be able to invite you back. This exhibition is one that we at the New Britain Museum of American Art are especially excited about. It marks the premiere debut of our acquisition of Kara Walker's eponymous print series. So we purchased the print series that's on view last year. And secondly, the exhibition launched the New Britain Museum of American Art's 2020 20 Plus Women at NBMAA initiative, in which all of our exhibitions throughout 2020 have been dedicated exclusively to female identifying artists in celebration of women's suffrage in America. So this was the first show of our 2020 initiative, and also a body of work that we were incredibly excited to acquire. This video that you're about to watch was recorded about a month following our closure due to COVID. So when COVID closed, we were about 3 days away from opening an Annie Albert's exhibition, and our Kara Walker exhibition had been open for only about a month. So from the comfort of our homes, we recorded the audio, and it was a rather surreal experience, I have to say. We have, in the past 2 months, we've experienced a tremendous reckoning throughout our nation and beyond in recognizing and acknowledging the pervasive racial injustice that exists in our country, as well as the senseless deaths of countless Black Americans as a result of police brutality and racially motivated violence. And now the violence reflected in Kara Walker's work feels much more immediate. And to tie it back into the program title, her work, the images feel much more intimately entwined with our present, as if drawn directly from the images of violence that we are now seeing on our TVs, in our Facebook feeds, and on our newspapers. Her images really embody the anger and mourning, I think, that we feel now, today. So thank you all for tuning in. I will now cue up the video, and I hope this plays okay. And I look forward to speaking about Kara Walker's work now and hopefully at the museum. So bear with me for just a moment as I...
Hello, my name is Minjung Kim, and I am the Director and CEO of the New Britain Museum of American Art. I'm delighted to share with you a virtual walkthrough of our current exhibition, Kara Walker, Harper's Pictorial History of the Civil War Annotated, a presentation that has particular significance for our museum. The exhibition marks the launch of the New Britain Museum of American Art's 2020 20+ Women Initiative, for which all of our exhibitions have been dedicated to female identifying artists in honor of the Centennial of women's suffrage in America. Throughout the year, we will be presenting a series of special exhibitions and reinterpreting our permanent collection installations to bring greater diversity and representation of women artists in our galleries. This initiative is made possible by the generous support of Stanley Black & Decker, presenting sponsor of the NBMAA's 2020 20+ Women Initiative. Additional support has been provided by Bank of America. This exhibition also marks the debut of the museum's recent acquisition of Walker's important print series, Harper's Pictorial History of the Civil War Annotated, reflecting our commitment to celebrate the work of important women artists, not only through exhibitions, but also through acquisitions that will allow us to present diverse perspectives of American art to our visitors today, as well as for generations to come. The exhibition is also made possible by the generosity of the Polytheist Charitable Trust, and programming is made possible by the Connecticut Humanities. And last but certainly not least, I'm grateful to my colleagues here at the museum and to our members and patrons for your continued support of the museum and for making projects like this possible. I'm delighted now to share insights from our Associate Curator, Lisa Hayes Williams. We hope to welcome you back to the museum and to the exhibition very soon.
Hello, my name is Lisa Hayes Williams, and I'm the Associate Curator at the New Britain Museum of American Art. Today, I'm excited to take you through our current exhibition, Kara Walker, Harper's Pictorial History of the Civil War Annotated. Kara Walker is one of the most influential artists working today. For nearly 3 decades, she has created pioneering work that explores race, gender, identity, and American history. Her powerful compositions utilize the form of the black and white cut paper silhouette, a medium that is traditionally associated with 19th century portrait profiles of the upper middle class. Walker appropriates this rather sentimental art form to construct provocative narratives that expose or confront inequality and prejudice, as well as stereotypes that pervade society. Walker's art is typically set against the backdrop of historical events, including the Civil War, thereby challenging viewers to recognize unsettling parallels between our nation's past and its present. This exhibition marks the premiere debut of the New Britain Museum of American Art's 2019 acquisition of Walker's important series, Harper's Pictorial History of the Civil War Annotated. Created in 2005, this work comprises a suite of 15 large-scale prints that consider experiences of racism and violence that were absent or only alluded to in historical representations of the Civil War. Each print in the portfolio includes an enlargement of an original woodcut plate from Harper's Pictorial History of the Civil War, a 2-volume compendium published in 1866 with the intention of narrating events of the war, according to the editors, just as they occurred. By overlaying silhouette figures upon the scenes, Walker visually disrupts the original images and suffuses them with traumatic scenarios left out of the official record. In this way, Walker activates the past in order to address the reality of racial conflict that persists in the United States today. Let's explore a few of the works in the exhibition. One of the first prints that visitors encounter upon entering the gallery is entitled Confederate Prisoners Being Conducted from Jonesboro to Atlanta. I think it's fascinating to compare the original Harper's illustrations with Kara Walker's contemporary interventions. The original Harper's image of this scene depicts a group of Confederate soldiers being marched to Atlanta after being captured in Jonesboro, Georgia. One is struck by the seemingly endless throng of weary soldiers as they travel on foot cast a group of white civilians to the left. Let's look at Walker's intervention. Here, the original image is superimposed by a large silhouette profile of an African American man. When juxtaposed, the soldiers depicted in the original Harper's engraving appear to gaze at the silhouette, whose oversized scale precludes it from being ignored or disregarded. Although absent from the original scene, and many Civil War depictions for that matter, Walker's work reminds us emphatically of the plight of African American slaves and their presence in this American conflict. In this and other works throughout the show, she makes history's invisible participants visible again. The flat opacity of their forms grab our attention and boldly obscure the subject of the original print. Another fascinating example is a composition entitled Buzzards Roost Pass. The original Harper's image depicts the advance of Union troops into a sweeping valley in northwest Georgia. What is perhaps most immediately striking about this image is not the violence inherent to the exchange of cannon shots underway, but the staggering beauty of the landscape. In Kara Walker's version, however, the brutality and carnage of the war is made horrifically apparent in the fragments of a woman's figure scattered both within and outside of the image. In the mid-1800s, the entire South was economically and politically dependent upon cotton, as well as slave labor to plant, maintain, and harvest the crop. Throughout the Civil War, Union troops were tasked with finding and confiscating cotton produced by Southern plantations. Confederates hid hordes of cotton bales in swamps along these waterways in an attempt to prevent Union troops from finding them, as depicted in this scene entitled Cotton Hordes in Southern Swamp. Emerging from the swamp, Walker overlays a moss-covered figure that echoes the elegant, sinuous form of the tree branches, referring perhaps to the runaway slaves who also took to hiding in swamps and marshlands during the Civil War. Although her silhouettes appear to echo and interact with the illustrations beneath them, in this work and others, there is no clear narrative between the two. Her shadowy figures represent a hidden history running parallel to these published scenes that force us to confront themes of race, gender, violence, and power. Juxtaposed with Walker's 15 prints is a group of original Harper's engravings of the Civil War by acclaimed American artist Winslow Homer, drawn from the museum's permanent collection. Among a select group of artist reporters employed by Harper's, a leading magazine of the 1800s, Winslow Homer was sent to the front lines beginning in 1861 at the young age of 25 to illustrate battle scenes and camp life. Embedded with Union troops, Homer undertook often dangerous and exhausting work to document his encounters, original examples of which are on view here, including A Shell in the Rebel Trenches, 1863, The War for the Union, a Cavalry Charge, 1862, and Winter Quarters at Camp, the Inside of a Hut, 1862. These two bodies of work, original Harper's illustrations and their contemporary retelling by Kara Walker, executed more than a century apart, reveal diverse perspectives of the Civil War and suggest that history remains an always fraught and always contested narrative.
It's very moving, very beautiful. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you.
Just wondering, should we entertain some questions now before we move into Professor Williamson's presentation? No? Okay. Would anyone like to comment or ask a question at this juncture?
I have a question.
Okay.
Can you give us more of a background on Carol Walker, her history, or anything else about her?
I can share a few anecdotes to just provide a little bit of context. She is absolutely one of the most important artists working today. In terms of her biography, Carol Walker was born in 1969 in Stockton, California. And she grew up in an integrated community. Her father was a painter, actually, a really incredible artist and respected professor. And at age 12, Walker moved to Stone Mountain, Georgia with her family, where she remained until the age of 22. And it was really there that she describes experiencing deeply ingrained racism for the first time. It was the 1980s, I think, and Ku Klux Klan rallies were still being held in Stone Mountain. And I don't know if anybody is familiar with Stone Mountain, Georgia, but if you look up images, there's a landmark there. It's actually dominated by a huge rock carving of Confederate generals, the largest bas relief of its kind in the world. And what a place to grow up, what a backdrop to have, growing up with. So this experience came to inform much of her work. And it was there that her father had gotten a job in academia, and she really saw him kind of disparaged racially for the first time. So it's there that identity formation comes into play. And she attended Atlanta College of Art in the early 90s. And she talks about, at an early age, being really interested in painting and gesture, but being aware that she was working within a sort of male-dominated medium, and that she wasn't really able to express her ideas, her feelings authentically through that medium. And so it wasn't until she moved on to the Rhode Island School of Design, following her undergrads, where she began to address race and gender and identity politics in her work. And she describes looking at historical representations of African Americans and Black people, and coming upon the silhouette and having kind of an epiphany. And the silhouette is this very sort of craft. It's not a fine art medium, it's more of a craft medium. It was frequently used in Victorian era to capture the likenesses of family members in more complicated forms. They could be cut to describe tableaus or narratives. And for her, the idea of using a silhouette, a black and white cut silhouette, was so symbolic and so resonant. She talks about how the silhouette represents a whole, like a whole part, but also a whole, like an empty whole. There's the positive, the negative. She talks about silhouettes. She analogizes them as being similar to stereotypes. They say a lot with very little information. And so she takes this very kind of genteel art form and flips it on its head so as to kind of have a little power play. So now she is creating these narratives that, instead of being genteel, are horrific. They're expressive of violence, of sexuality, and compressing American history. So conflating historical events like the Civil War with violence that is still rampant in our country. And she's very interested in fiction and history, and she really wants to draw the viewer into fiction, into history. There's a sort of perverseness, like a car crash. You can't really look away. You are just captivated by this imagery. And she means for her work to be very provocative, I think, unsettling and disturbing. And it's been controversial, even among other, famous African-American and Black artists have found her work kind of controversial. So, but she really established herself in terms of being one of the only artists to pioneer this kind of medium, the silhouette form, and she's created large-scale tableaus, room-sized tableaus. In fact, if you go to the Wadsworth Athenaeum, in their contemporary gallery, you'll often see they have one installed. She's also worked in film as well. One of the most well-known works that she did, one of the most monumental pieces that she did, was called A Subtlety in the Domino Sugar Factory in Brooklyn in the earlier, around 2010, 2009, I can't remember, but the Zadie Smith article does address that work. And also her recent monumental fountain that she installed, the turbine. That's a little bit of a nutshell contextualization.
That's great. Thank you so much, Lisa. I'm going to ask, maybe
Right.
we'll hold off on the other questions till after Professor Williamson's presentation, and then we can wrestle with all of our issues, all of our questions. So I'm going to introduce Professor Williamson. It's my pleasure to do that, and it's really an honor to have you here with us tonight. Professor Marisa Williamson is a project-based artist who works in video, image making, installation, and performance. She has produced site-specific works at Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, Storm King Art Center, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, University of Virginia, and by commission from the National Park Service. Her work has been featured in gallery exhibitions nationally and internationally, including New York City, Philadelphia, Chicago, Los Angeles, and Rome. She was a 2012 participant in the Skokie School of Painting and Sculpture and the Whitney Museum's Independent Study Program in 2014 to 2015. Professor Williamson holds a BA from Harvard and an MFA from Cal Arts. She's an assistant professor of media arts at the University of Hartford, and she lives in Newark, New Jersey. Professor Williamson, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, and thank you. I see friends, family in the list of participants, and I'm also really glad to be among new folks from all around the area, being able to kind of come together in a moment of isolation. I really value that, and thank you, Donna and Lisa, for having me here today. I was so excited for this invitation because I am incredibly inspired by Kara Walker's work. I'm also inspired by Zadie Smith's work. To be able to even virtually be in conversation with these two women is a real nice opportunity for me. I think I knew about Kara Walker's work from a fairly young age, but when I was a senior in college, my mom took me to the Whitney Museum to see her retrospective, and we were really struck by being the only two Black women in the gallery that day and feeling that we stood against these figures who in silhouette resembled us, but we were the only two real Black people in the room. And I was struck by the effect of that work on me and on the people around me, as far as being able to suss out how projection, how fantasy, how repressed thoughts, how people's subconscious get projected onto the figures on the wall, but also onto one another in actual space. And I was compelled as an artist to think about how to make Kara Walker's figures more dimensional. I was really struck by the flattening of historical figures, which is a really powerful effect, but also one that reminds us of all that we're missing, of all that we can't see about our ancestors. And so my work as a performance artist, as a visual artist and conceptual artist has been to try to give these historical figures dimension by intervening in public sites, in historical sites, and figuring out how performance and media can draw out that kind of figure from the darkness, from the shadow there. So I put together a kind of slideshow, which in my mind further illustrates the essay. I hope you've had a chance to check out this great Zadie Smith essay that accompanies this talk, and I think was featured in accompaniment to the Fons Americanus, which is the fountain piece at the Tate that Lisa mentioned. But the essay by Zadie Smith, who's a Black British essayist and author, great books, attempts to kind of psychologize and go deep into the mind of Kara Walker and of her work, which is something I appreciate in kind of Black feminist authorship, is the attempt to kind of give dimension to Black women and their work. So Speak to Me Always of Our Intimate Relation is the name of this gathering and the name I'm giving to this presentation of ideas. But yeah, please feel free to follow along with the essay. And if you have a question, you can chime in, but I'm also hoping to have a discussion at the end. The essay, you can find it online, the New York Review of Books, but it starts with this illustration of two women bound at the waist. And I think for most people in this country, this image reminds them of Gone with the Wind, a film I didn't see until being an adult, but it was a film that once I saw it, it seemed kind of completely out of place. It feels from a kind of inappropriate time, but I'm aware that it's a film that people very much grew up with. And Kara Walker has an amazing way of taking familiar, different relationship to each other, juxtaposition, to kind of haunt our own cherished, our own treasured memories and turn them in on themselves to illuminate what is below the surface there. So you can see this illustration on the side there, and I wanted to just draw us to the scene from the film in which a woman who we know only as Mammy is charged with, keeping her eye on Scarlett, the protagonist. And in this scene, the kind of most notable scene is doing up her stays. I assume people are fairly familiar with the film. The film was recently taken offline. And one of the themes of my kind of conversation today is this question of monumental works, whether they're monuments or films or images or artworks that hold a kind of monumental place in our lives, and what it means to have a fraught and contested narrative operating through these monuments. And Gone with the Wind, I think, is one of these works that certainly rewrote the past and really embedded itself in people's consciousness, and is something we're working today to try to reckon with. And Kara Walker is doing just that. She mentions in her text another reference you might have when you see this figure being pulled in two directions with a Mammy figure and someone who resembles a Scarlett. You might be thinking about Nanny of the Maroons, which is a lesser known, hair-tied figure, a freedom fighter from Jamaica who is on their $500 bill. She is a woman who led Black Jamaicans in overthrowing their colonial empire, and she has been put on their currency. I know recently there had been some idea that Harriet Tubman might make her way onto the $20 bill. And I want to just remind you that monuments can take a lot of different forms. They can be like something you pass around and are something small that's in and out of your wallet every day. It can be something big. And so I want us to keep in mind as we think about monuments of the many big and small ways monuments appear. When I read this Zadie Smith essay, and when I look at Kara Walker's work, I'm often reminded of poetry. I think both artists deal with words and their definitions and playing around with different types of definition. In that first page of the essay, Zadie Smith talks about one woman defining the other through this struggle, through this pulling apart. And for Kara Walker, the silhouette is also a type of line drawing, a boundary creation. And that words, definitions, playing around with words was an incredibly illuminating force for many people in being able to kind of suss out this relationship to the past, the kind of ghostly relationship with the past. This poem, I just want to read you a few lines. You may write me down in history, with your bitter, twisted lies. You may trod me in the very dirt, but still like dust, I rise. Does my sassiness upset you? Why are you beset with gloom? Because I walk like I've got oil wells pumping in my living room. Just like moons and like suns with the uncertainty of tides, just like hopes springing high, still I rise. Did you want to see me broken, bowed head and lowered eyes? Shoulders falling down like teardrops, weakened by my soulful cries. Does my haughtiness offend you? Don't you take it awful hard, 'cause I laugh like I've got gold mines, digging in my own backyard. You may shoot me with your words, you may cut me with your eyes, you may kill me with your hatefulness, but still like air, I rise. Does my sexiness upset you? Does it come as a surprise that I dance like I've got diamonds at the meeting of my thighs? Out of the huts of history's shame, I rise. Up from a past that's rooted in pain, I rise. I am a black ocean, leaping and wide, welling and swelling, I bear in the tide. Leaving behind nights of terror and fear, I rise. Into a daybreak that's wondrously clear, I rise. Ooh. Bringing the gifts that my ancestors gave, I am the dream and the hope of the slave. I rise, I rise, I rise. I wanted to read that poem to just provide some language and a sense of voice from which we might consider talking through the figures that we see in Kara Walker's work and the figures conjured by Zadie Smith and by the figures conjured by different types of monuments, many of which conjure the figurative, people's bodies, historical leaders, many of whom are white males, but then in their presence remind us that there are so many unpictured figures, and those unpictured, unfigured figures may be a kind of haunting force who could utter any particular line in this poem as a warning, as a kind of testament to the undying presence of history in our world today. A word that I find really compelling, another definition, a manuscript or something written on that has been erased and then rewritten and erased. I like to think of it as a kind of prop in a detective story where someone's written on a notepad and taken off the notepad, and then you might be able to scratch your pencil across the notepad and pull out the message that is left behind. And I think of Kara Walker's work, I think of Zadie Smith's work, I think of some of the works I'm going to present today as being messages written one on top of the other. And part of what we have to do is figure out how to pull out the kind of underlying layers in those texts, in those written documents, those visual documents, to figure out what they're saying and what they're actually saying to us that we might not fully be aware of. I'd be really curious to know what people think of Gone with the Wind when we finish, since I think there's a few different generational levels on which that particular monument operates. A work I saw recently that I found really convincing and effective is this film. It's a play. I don't know if people know, but the National Theatre of England is broadcasting plays for a limited time, limited, like a week at a time, and you can log in to YouTube and watch these plays. And this play was called Small Island, and it was about immigrants from Jamaica coming to the UK following World War II. And I'll share this PowerPoint with you later. I can send a link to you, and you can actually click on this and get a link to the play. I've downloaded it. Don't tell anyone, and you can download it and watch it. But I thought it might be helpful to look at the struggles around monuments in another country as a way to kind of approach our own. So in England right now, I'm sure people may be following this story, but as they have here, they've been struggling with questions of what's appropriate to keep up in public space. And there's a short video I wanted to play for you that I think some of the figures in the video articulate well how the very many layers of this contested public space the layers of discourse around it are
The most visceral
operating.
part was it being thrown into the harbor. That's what really got me. Port cities are the places most well known in the UK for slavery. Middle Passage is that part where the enslaved Africans were taken from the West Coast over to the Americas. The Atlantic Ocean, the Middle Passage, has claimed so many lives. Edward Colston is almost like being returned to that. He's being sent into a watery grave.
The consequence of slavery is racism. The killing of George Floyd was racism. And that statue, because they've been protesting a long time.
The statue of Edward Colston in Bristol is just one of many dedicated to white men who were involved in the UK's slave trade. Cities all over the country have profited from slavery, with the money building houses, schools, streets and hospitals.
People think it's hyperbole when we say it's built into every brick of the nation, but it's not.
The roads you're walking on is a product of slavery. What those men did, like Coulson, is not removable.
This is the statue of William Gladstone. He was the son of a slave owner and opposed to abolishing slavery. He was also a 4-time British Prime Minister. Just this one man has statues in Manchester, London, Liverpool, Bolton, Edinburgh, Glasgow and Harden, a small village in Wales. There are also numerous schools, a library, a university hall and streets all over the country bearing that name.
Statues have so much power, right? What does it mean to carve someone's likeness? What does it mean to take time to look at someone's visage and all the power and thought? People automatically see someone literally on a pedestal and they think one thing. We need to somehow break down that barrier and have people think of someone on a statue might not be good.
Sir Jeff Palmer has been campaigning for a plaque to be put on this statue of a man called Henry Dundas in Edinburgh for 13 years.
So Wilberforce put up the bill that the slave trade should be immediately abolished. 1792, Henry Dundas put down an amendment to say it will be gradually abolished. And that allowed the slave trade to continue from 1792 to 1807, 15 years. And I've calculated that in 15 years, 630,000 black people were moved into slavery on one word: gradual. The original plaque, nothing about slavery. And I said that must be on the plaque.
There are some statues that are, some acts that are so horrific that they need to go and in their place something completely new. In other cases, I think there are times when we can use those monuments as an educational tool. But I also am very much aware that we also need to balance educating with the trauma and hurt that it can cause people. Somehow the onus on educating people on racism and on the effects of slavery and colonialism always falls on those who are the oppressed.
I will not support a consistent policy of removing everything that relates to slavery. I want improvements for black people in the country. I want improvements in education. I want this history to go in the curriculum, to be there to change.
We need to break down our original thinking of these kind of monuments and start from scratch, which is easier said than done.
I wanted to just share that video. I thought that the commentators touched on a lot of the really resonant themes these days with regard to monuments and the type of gaze that they project out onto the world, that those of us who have to walk under these monuments have to be subject to the vision, the kind of speculative vision of the people standing above us. And at the same time, while others are making a case for forgetting the past or getting over the past, in places like England, where I was the summer that the Grenfell Tower burned down, there seems to be an extreme neglect of the people who arguing for the making the case that oppression is ongoing seem to be not only silenced, but kind of continually buried by the systems that went into colonizing the places where they came from. And I think one thing that Kara Walker gets at, one thing that Zadie Smith gets at as a Black British woman, is the kind of incongruous, discordant, and complicated messaging that comes out of authority figures when it comes to what it means to remember and what it means never to forget. This quote was in the essay. I thought it was really effective. What you leave behind is not what is engraved in stone monuments, but what is woven into the lives of others. And a lot of these narratives, Gone with the Wind, these people put on pedestals, are woven not just into a kind of storyline, a sense of collective identity, but also woven into the bricks, woven into the infrastructure, woven into how money, resources are redistributed for people. And Kara Walker's work, I think, begins to give an illustration for us of the kind of psychological impact, the psychological haunting that kind of woven in integration, inability to separate, really plays, how that affects people in their everyday lives. As Lisa mentioned, one of her most recent works is this Fons Americanus, which is a fountain featured in the Turbine Hall at the Tate Modern. It borrows, when you look at it more closely, you realize that these figures come out of Kara Walker's, psyche, out of this grammar of figures that she has accumulated over the years. And she and Zadie Smith both encourage a real close looking at these figures to kind of suss out the very many layers of meaning buried inside them. I was particularly drawn to this figure down here of borrowed from a Winslow Homer painting that as a kid I remember being really haunted by. The Gulf Stream features this Black man in a boat with a shark swimming around him. I remember kind of standing fixated in the museum, struggling to wrap my mind around this situation that I think is really appropriate to include in this kind of water scene around what Kara Walker's put together as a kind of monument to the Black experience, the transatlantic experience, and how it resonates on both sides of the ocean. There's the original. An artist who I think is also similarly trying to figure out ways of replacing or contextualizing monuments, or somehow providing another written document on top of the palimpsest, a writing over of documents, is the artist Hank Willis Thomas. He's an American artist who's done a great number of public works, public sculptures, has a project called For Freedoms, where artists are commissioned to make billboards. But this was a very recent project of his. On the left is a sculpture installed in a gallery in Antwerp, which is kind of an arm protruding from the wall, holding a hand. Out of context, it's hard to know what you're looking at, or what its context is, or whether it's a violent or kind of, an excerpt of something larger, or which, it's hard to know which part of it is excerpt, but it comes from a fountain that looks a lot like the fountain Kara Walker made, that is a tribute to this Belgian myth of a young man killing a giant and cutting his hand off. And as you can see, water in the kind of, as a mimesis for blood, is flowing out of that hand. But it also seems by accident, but hardly able to settle as an accident, to reference this Belgian history of colonizing the Congo, and as a punishment for disobedience among the Black population who were subjected, oppressed, enslaved there, cutting off the hands of those workers. And capture the complicated nature of trying to make sense of monuments, give them some additional meaning, put another layer on them. And I think one of the struggles as an artist, and I think something that people struggle with in Kara Walker's work, is how do we train an audience to read these things, and how do we all elevate our literacy around such subjects so that these three images can be held in mind at the same time when looking at one or the other of them. Some questions that came out of the reading that were really compelling after a section, if you've read it, it was pretty harrowing, about this Jamaican slave owner who just had kept a journal, on one side of which was his kind of agricultural exploits, and on the other, every other page on the right was his exploits as they related to sexual exploitation of the Black enslaved people, violence, torture, really psychopathic things. But one of the questions, a series of questions that comes out of that passage that Zadie Smith posits are, what is the correct artistic response to a history like this? When we read something violent, when we see something jarring, which aspects should be obscured or tidied away, carefully contextualized to protect the viewer's sensibility? And what relationship do we stand to our ancestors if we insist we cannot now even stand to hear or see what they themselves had no choice but to live through? It's not the least we owe the suffering of the past a full and frank account of them. What is the appropriate level of interest in the interrelation of sex and violence in our history? I also included, for some levity, a cartoon by a Philadelphia cartoonist, a city I'm from, a city I love, but has many monuments like many of these Eastern cities. And Signe Wilkinson is trying to kind of shed some light on what that context might look like. Is it bodies piled up? And are those bodies, I think part of what haunts us is, are those bodies from the past, or are they bodies that continue to pile up at the feet of these monuments to white supremacy? I think what Kara Walker does in her work is try to, as she says, as Zadie Smith says in the end of the essay, is to jar the reader into, lull them at first into thinking that her work, what they're looking at, is about history, but then somehow throwing in some element. Maybe it's the Black person standing in the gallery with you, maybe it's you, a Black person, looking at the work, but reminding yourself through the work that what she's conjuring, what she's representing, is not in fact dead or gone, but still around us. Among my projects as an artist have been to go to perform or to try to recontextualize the monuments in that space through augmented reality or some sort of programming. And these were some images I took in Virginia. I was invited to the University of Virginia the year after the Unite the Right rally there on August 11th and 12th of, I think it was 2018. And I was struck by, I'd been there before, but struck when I came again there to how central figures like Thomas Jefferson are on the campus, how central they are to everyone's narrative there, how the monuments operate at different levels. So this elevation of Jefferson versus this submerged, ground level plaque acknowledging a slave auction in downtown Charlottesville. And then at the time of this kind of augmented, wrapped up monument of Robert E. Lee, which still stands in Charlottesville. I think what is so incredibly problematic in Charlottesville is that the Lee statue still stands, that there are still forces operating, white supremacy, the threat of violence from the far right that manages to still hold hostage the people in that town and this kind of public space, and holds it still as white supremacist space. And I think Kara Walker's work, while provocative, is also, as someone mentioned, been a really powerful force to provide a voice in constant reminder, a haunting voice, a ghostly voice, reminding us for many years now that the alternative voice, the voice of white supremacy, is not dead and gone, but still needs to be spoken up and out against. This work was mentioned as subtlety at the Domino Sugar Factory in Brooklyn. Carol Walker did extensive research to figure out what materials would go into this monumental form. We again see a kind of mammy figure, an Aunt Jemima figure, who's also now come back into the news as a monument, a kind of everyday monument to white supremacy, to Black subjugation, who's finally gotten some rest, being retired by the General Mills. Finally, she will, be able to exist elsewhere other than on the bottles of maple syrup. But we see this figure conjured again, and I think Lisa mentioned that Carol Walker received backlash early on from audiences that said her work was too provocative, but also received backlash from African-American artists, all of whom are in a legacy of trying to figure out the burden of representation and how representation of Black women, of Black people, should be brought to the public. Betty Saar, and I'm sorry for this really long quote, but I couldn't decide where to cut it off because in these kind of spaces. But Betty Saar is a pretty prolific artist, the mother of, as you can see at the bottom, of Black women's movement, the Black women's art movement. And her conjuring of Aunt Jemima was to position her as a superhero and to engage with questions with imagery of pop art, with imagery of Black resistance, with a gun, and to try in a moment of kind of an urge for Black uplift to figure out how to reappropriate the image of Aunt Jemima and, put her in this box, but kind of create a shrine to her. And I think it's really interesting to see the kind of morphology of figures like this, Aunt Jemima, as Black artists, female artists, feminist artists have tried to reclaim and wrestle with these images, because this question of definition, how one identifies oneself from the background, how one pulls and conjures up an identity out of a Black hole of history where erasure is the norm, can only be performed in many ways through using the material given to you. So Aunt Jemima, as she appears on the syrup bottle, Aunt Jemima, as she appears in these offensive objects circulated in the South and in the North, all of these become material for artists who are left with nothing but research and these kind of reflections, refractions, distortions of the past. I feel appreciate the lineage of this Black feminist art movement. I appreciate being able to use media and performance in my work to kind of be in conversation with women who've been using found objects, found material, paraphernalia. And while I'm not going to play the entirety of this video, I just want to introduce this as the kind of work that a lot of artists today are trying to make, which is work that engages with, forces interaction, and demands that people not just look at the work, stand in a space with it where there are audience members around them in a quiet gallery, a white space, but that people actually confront the kind of history of these colonial projects.
I don't like you, but I love you. Seems that I'm always thinking of you. Oh, you treat me wrong now. I love you strong now. You really got a hold on me. You really got a hold on me. I wanna leave you, don't wanna. Another day here, no, you do me wrong now. I love you strong now, you really got a hold on me. I don't like you, but I love you. Seems I'm always thinking of you.
How's that? But that work comes from a project that I did at Monticello in 2013, where at that time I'd been drawn to the figure of Sally Hemings for many of the same reasons. I believe that Carol Walker and Betty Saar are drawn to figures like Aunt Jemima. There was a feeling of correspondence with this historical figure. Sally Hemings is the slave of Thomas Jefferson, and she bore 4 children at least by him, and lived at Monticello, died a slave, while all 4 of her children were ultimately freed. Jefferson freed no other nuclear family, very few, at least that was the only nuclear family that he freed at his death from Monticello. And I had been immersed in white communities, in white institutions, and was beginning to feel as though it was only through a kind of metonymic stepping into this role of a historical figure that I might be able to draw attention to what I felt. What seemed to jump up frequently, haunt me, were moments of kind of reemergence of the past, language of the past, structures and power dynamics of the past that it seemed only I could see. And so I think, similar to some of these artists over the past 50 years, there's been an interest in trying to figure out how the conjuring of our ancestors, how the hope and the dream of the slave, how the Still I Rise operates in the art world, how it can operate in pictures and images and silhouettes and performance in public space as a kind of substitute for the big physical monument, which it seems to take so many resources, so much power, so much political agency to erect. And performance can in many ways kind of challenge that kind of static monument by being more active, more alive, undead, unsettling the settler. I wanted to add, because Betty Saar kind of tears Kara Walker down at the early part of her career for being someone who makes work for a white audience, I have linked this article in the PowerPoint, which I'll send to you, but it's a really interesting article about how artists have dealt with the white gaze over the course of history, starting with people like Phyllis Wheatley, who's a really compelling, someone from our area, from Africa, kidnapped in Africa at the age of 8, brought to Boston, enslaved there, was a prodigy, taught herself to read, was disbelieved by Jefferson to be as smart as she was. He doubted that she had produced the poetry that she did, poetry that Sally Hemings likely read herself. But Michael Denzel Smith writes about Phyllis Wheatley, about James Baldwin, who is another person to check out these days if you're trying to figure out, a voice to look to for this kind of legacy of white supremacy in ways that people can conceive of it, wrap their minds around it, and then try to dismantle it. But this kind of narrative of being, someone who creates work for the white viewer is age old, and also part of this, as W.B. Du Bois calls it, double consciousness, this idea of having another view of yourself, one at all times as an African American, of the white gaze. And it's something that W.B. Du Bois, as a scholar, believes he can cite through sociological research, but it's something he himself struggled with. I really love this mural in Philadelphia, which I did some work about, because you find him here pictured on the left, but also you see him again in the crowd in the mural. And I think it's a kind of illustration by an artist, but also through the work borrowing from images of Du Bois and his own language himself, an illustration, a monumental illustration of what that kind of doubling feels like. And for Kara Walker, one thing that Zadie Smith points out in the essay is that people often are so overwhelmed by her work that they forget to notice the figures at the center of them, often Black women who are in some ways seeking liberation, even as the rest of the image, the rest of the composition kind of acts to frame and consume that figure. I would encourage you to keep an eye out for moments of artistic innovation, intervention, free thinking. It's kind of what the author, Zadie Smith, concludes at the end. Phyllis Wheatley, as I said, is a really interesting figure, and is an escape room which was a performance I put on with collaborators in Cleveland, where we created, I don't know if anyone's ever done an escape room, but you solve puzzles, you move with a group, usually through a space, trying to unlock the different challenges in order to get out. And I brought these women, these performers together to create an escape room where people learned about the lives of Sally Hemings, Phyllis Wheatley, and Tituba of Salem Village, another local kind of people on the cusp of, you know, people we can look at for being on the cutting edge of racial justice in their moment. Tituba was tortured, accused of being a witch. We have record of her confession, which was a forced confession. And so we read her with a limited text, but she is someone who's suffering in the early 17th century, in many ways mirrors the way the social criminal justice system continues to operate unfairly for people of color. Sally Hemings, as we know, a victim of sexual violence, lacks the ability to fully consent. And so bringing that kind of message into a space for people to learn and just have a conversation about was incredibly important to the team that put this on. And again, Phyllis Wheatley addressing this question of Black intellectual freedom, authenticity. This is another type of monument. Again, an example of people taking up what Kara Walker has begun, this idea of representing figures, but flatly, and trying to add dimension to them, to propose an alternate monument to the ones we see being torn down, of figures highly articulated and elevated in our public space. I'll leave you to read these quotes, but a work that I did fairly early on that was interesting to me as far as being able to fully illustrate this Kara Walker figures coming off the wall was to kind of inhabit one of her silhouettes and perform in a gallery, trying to just really figure out how to psychologize and get inside the silhouettes that Kara Walker haunts us all with. The quote that I have here is by author Annette Gordon-Reed, who is informed a lot of my work around Sally Hemings. And one thing that Annette Gordon-Reed points out is that this idea of powerlessness of the figures in the past, the Black silhouettes, Kara Walker's characters, the idea of powerlessness is attractive to white and Black people, but for different reasons. And she talks about the different value that these narratives perform for people. One of complete subjugation that allows us to wonder, and when we think about what we want history to do to us, that we are and always have been victims. And for white people, that idea can also be empowering as a way of thinking about a time where white supremacy was solidified, and that solidification of white supremacy continues on. But what a lot of Black feminist scholars have managed to do in recent years is to help add dimension to figures so that that powerlessness is not so concrete and not so crystallized in the past. And by telling the stories of historical figures like Sally Hemings and Phyllis Wheatley and Tituba, we're able to see that power has always been something that flows. And while it is incredibly lopsided and misappropriated, some of what we get by digging deeper into the shadows of the past is the ability to understand how power flowed. And in my research on Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson, what's really emerged for me is that the dimension of that story, while it doesn't strip Sally Hemings of a victimhood that she most likely, very definitely was subject to, it does recognize that a victim's life has much more dimension beyond its victimhood, and that it puts into question the absolute power of someone like Jefferson and the absolute disempoweredness of Sally Hemings, and I think offers people in the present the ability to put these people on different types of pedestals than they've been previously put. It brings Jefferson down to earth as a person who, despite his claims for independence, was a very dependent person who could not get dressed in the morning, get out the door, do anything without the bonded service of a plantation full of Black people, some of whom were, in direct relation to his wife, Sally Hemings, and his wife, who had died Martha Wales Jefferson. We're half sisters. And it also allows us to see Sally Hemings as someone who exercised a great deal of agency despite the odds, the obstacles, the oppression that she and her family suffered. And part of what alternative monuments, performative monuments can do are to actually make those pedestals, those things on which these sculptures stand, inverted, or to move them around, or to recontextualize them. I'll go more quickly. I recommend people checking out this book, Dark Matters, because I think one of the roles that monuments play is to surveil us, but we also have the power to counter-surveil, and by taking the place of monuments, moving around with eyes like monuments, surveil the kind of oppression and call it to order that we're seeing these days. And yeah, I wanted to just conclude by saying that I look forward to very dense, and I pulled out just a few things that resonated with me. But I wanted to ask whether people felt that with all of these layers, they could find a place to orient themselves personally, because I think what Kara Walker's doing and what Zadie Smith are doing are really courageous acts. What artists are doing these days, Black artists, artists of all sorts, are trying to figure out how not simply to look at work from a distance, but how to really enter it and find their location in it. And I think it's only, and especially through art and reading groups, which I love, that we can start to have a dialogue about where we all stand in relation to a single thing, which can be an artwork, a monument, a performance work. And so I wanted to leave you with a few little questions, no, not little questions. And Barbara and Donna's gonna help me with questions a bit, but I thought as a place to start, people might wanna answer these questions that Zadie Smith poses at the beginning of the essay. She asks, what do I want history to do to me? I ask, what do you want history to do to you? And these are some of the options she gives us. Reduce my historical antagonism, increase me, remind me, speak to me, tell me my future, promise me, warn me, argue, show me, and there are many things it can show us, convince me. And I really appreciated the prompt myself to figure out what in my performance work as an artist or educator I hope history will do for me. And I've also pulled up this image of the Angel of History, a painting by Paul Klee, cited by Walter Benjamin in an essay of mine, an essay that I really appreciate, I've been working with recently. The Angel of History is flying away, and Walter Benjamin conjures it in an essay he writes right before he's trying to escape the Nazis and seek passage to the United States and fails to do so, and is writing in these last moments about the rise of fascism and things he's observing and how history operates. And so I would just want to remind you all that the stakes are high, not here and now, but that we are in a moment where this kind of work really demands that we enter it, and enter it together, and with a courage that truly has the ability to transform. I'll leave it at that, but thank you. Yeah, I'm really excited to have a discussion.
I don't even really know what to say. That was magnificent. Thank you so much for teaching us tonight.
Of course.
Just want to give a moment because that was really so rich for us. That was really a gift. Thank you, Professor Williamson.
Yeah. Thank you.
Would anyone like to ask a question or make a comment? And that can be about Kara Walker's work, about Zadie Smith's work, about Professor Williamson's work, the questions that she asked at the end. It's a blank slate for you. And you can raise your hand. You know how to do that with the with the reactions button? Is that how you do it? I think so. Well, you can applaud or put a thumbs up. There's a way that you can raise your hand too. Or you can just speak out. That's fine too. Well, let me ask you this. How do you feel about what you heard?
Can I say something?
Sure, Imani.
Oh yeah, hi. I just thought the idea that you said that powerlessness in itself is not blanket. It's not complete. The idea that slaves are not there. There were certain characteristics of their lifestyle that were not, you know, totally controlled. Their powerlessness was not complete. But in the same way, power is also not complete. Sometimes I think we need to see the humanity behind things. So I would just say.
Yeah, you said it. I'm glad you got that. You said it even better than I did. I really appreciate you saying it back to me, because it is a really powerful thing to even just keep saying.
Anyone else?
Yes, I want to say, let me see, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
So I want to say that I'm incredibly moved by all of tonight's presentation, Kara Walker, Lisa's comments, Marissa's comments. It's very powerful on a lot of levels, and I feel very moved. And I have to say, I come from a position of white privilege and being very blind, and my education being very limited. And now coming to the age of 72 and feeling like, where have I been all this time? And how could I be so blindfolded and ignorant? And so there's just so much to learn. I've been watching Henry Louis Gates' series on PBS, and from beginning to end, I'm just totally wowed by the history of African Americans in this country. The one thing that is very powerful is the theme of violence through all of this, the threat of violence, and being so affected by how that's had an impact on our society, and where do we go from here. So for myself, I guess, Marissa, you asked something about can I orient myself personally. So for me personally, I need to catch up, and I want to hear people like you speak and look at Kara Walker's work in more detail and even more, and read and listen and just grow so that I can be so I can participate on a more even keel than what I have been.
Thank you. There are a lot of great books out there. I mean, I think Lisa said you would add a book list to a follow-up email. I find reading audiobooks, podcasts to be really comforting these days, and there's no end to the amount of learning anyone can do.
Yes.
It's good to have the energy to do it.
That is true. And I do think that that's important at this time, but I also think I'm a Jew, and I think of Germany having done a good job with information about the Holocaust. So I think maybe we need to look at what's been done in Germany and overall as a society as an example of what we might do on the educational vein here in this country.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Anyone else?
I might just follow up on Paula's comment, and you're inspiring me that at 72 you are challenging yourself and being accountable, as are so many of us really trying to catch up. And I think the fact that you say you feel ignorant is a little unfair to yourself, because even thinking about, being in the position of working in a museum, one of the first things that our director and I did 4 years ago when we came on board was we undertook a collections analysis to try to get a better understanding of the composition of the collection. And it was really shocking, the statistics. Out of roughly 8,700 works in the collection, about 75 are by African American or Black artists. That's less than 1%. And that is not even unique. That's characteristic of museums and institutions everywhere. And thank goodness there's a feeling of urgency that we need to address this and need to rectify this. And that's part of why the acquisition of Kara Walker's work was something we really felt was, a commitment to beginning to do that. But if the very structures that are meant to be supplying, meant to be offering educational resources are part of this like white supremacist structure and part of suppressing narratives of people, then we're very much accountable for that as well, for keeping people sort of with blinders on. So I think, in terms of what history is doing to us in the museum world is really providing facts, just glaring facts that are shocking and that we're really working to try to resolve and correct. It's a long journey. And it is, as somebody said in a recent webinar, it's not just about checking off the number of people represented in your collection, it's about changing the structure altogether and having conversations like this and establishing meaningful relationships.
Her question is interesting. Professor Williamson, would you go back to the last slide?
Yes, let's see.
It reminds me of Dylan Thomas saying, "Do not go gentle into that good night," as opposed to "do not go gently." Like the sentence itself reflects the idea of, fighting. Don't go gently, go gentle. Do not go gentle. And Zadie Smith's question, what do I want history to do to me? Actually, I think it was Kara Walker's question. It's not what do I want history to do for me or with me, it's to me. And I think that's interesting. I'm not sure what it means, but there's some kind of, there's a punch to it.
Yeah.
And there might be even some kind of a sexual nature to it, because a lot of Kara Walker's work is so kind of eroticized and talks about sexual violence. And it seems to me that might be implicit in the title also. Mm-hmm. And also the idea of oppression. You do something to someone. Mm-hmm. But if we go back to that slide, and so there's just my comments about the title, but would anyone like to enter into that conversation? What do you want history to do to you?
I'd like to enter in because I chose to describe Kara Walker's impact on me like having a railroad spike piercing my brain, and it was arresting. And I saw work huge in, I think it was at the Whitney, or maybe even Museum of Modern Art. But I remember being in the room and just staggered by my responding to it and how it forced me to reckon with layers and layers and layers. And at that time, I thought that I had been in a long reckoning and dealing with the, how do I put it, the catechism of Western art and taking care of all of the iconography that I'd learned and had to unlearn and then fill the vacuum of my lack of education about world cultures. What really does it mean to have a quote unquote Western art comprehension? And when I saw her work so stark and bold and proportions that made it impossible to ignore, I thought, this isn't ever going to end. This learning and reckoning will never stop, no matter how old I get. No matter what occurs, I'm always going to be turning over and over and reckoning as more artists force or reckon with their own issues. So I thought I'd put that on the table, that it's not a one-time shot. It's not over just because someone forces us to reckon once. And anyway, I just wanted to put that on the table, that there's a big hole in our comprehension of history to begin with. It's not what I wanted to do to me, it's what I want to do to it.
Thank you. Thank you. Very interesting. Would anyone else like, we just have a few more minutes. Would anyone else like to jump in?
I was just going to say that I think the pointedness of the question, what is history, what do I want history to do to me? Like so much great art, like Kara's and Marissa's, points out what's already happening, which is that history is shaping us in ways that we so often don't recognize. And it is doing things to us and causing us to do things in both directions. And so I think what they're really helpfully doing is sort of getting attention on an operation that's already in motion and the degree to which that is already a sculptural practice almost, and that shaping. And so that if you can be aware of it, and if you can ask the question of what you want that force that's coming towards you to do, and what you're going to do with that force and energy, then you can have some agency within it. But if you're not attentive to it, you can't even engage with that force. And so that's what I think is so helpful about works like this.
Oh, okay. So it's the awareness. It's awareness. Would you agree?
Awareness then you can make a choice within it. The awareness, and then you ask that question, and then you decide what to do with it, and then you start to build your own relationship to those forces. But awareness is just the first thing.
Right, and then Kara Walker's work is about, and Zadie Smith's too, is about making things visible, making us aware, and then we can move from that place. Would you say that that's what you're? Would you agree with that? Oh.
I've muted myself again in good Zoom practice. Yes, I think their awareness, but they're also showing the operations, right? So they're pointing to the way that history shapes, but they're also kind of cataloging in some way the degree to which different kinds of forces stay on, different kinds of operations are more or less visible in certain spaces, and inviting you not just to recognize or see, but then to put yourself in the scene and start to feel some of those things as they're happening or have happened, or make sense within your own life, and the ways in which history has in fact shaped you, has in fact acted on you, and then what you're going to do with that. That's my
thank you. Yeah, thank you. It just occurred to me as you were talking that, you know, there's so much exposure in Kara Walker's work. You know, people are naked and their body parts and all, and that her work really is about exposure. about exposing the systemic nature of racism and exposing the reality of what happened that we can so quote and don't, I forgive the pun, sugarcoat, you know.
I've been thinking, thank you. It's nice to hear from Saisha. I see you in the corner of my screen. I think that's such a great way to approach the question of doing is maybe there's something already happening and it's a reaction that we're actually being prompted to engage with. But it reminds me of questions of like exorcism. And I think when I look at Kara Walker's work, I'm often hoping that somehow history will speak for me. Like I won't have to do something if the history can merely, if I set everything up a certain way, maybe history will just speak for itself, I think is one of my approaches. And it seems to come from a kind of hope that it could exorcise or allow me to get something out. But it's not nearly as easy as it seems. It's kind of an illness, I think. Yeah, feels inside, something inside that needs to come out.
We have time maybe for, you okay with one more question? Is it okay? Yeah, one more question or comment? We could go on all night. This is so rich.
I had a very, very specific question. I can't see the gallery view right now. I don't. This is Lynn speaking. Can anybody hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, good. The image that was featured at the beginning of the museum presentation, and then that was again featured in the professor's wonderful presentation, the one that's overlaid with double at first, yes, that one, thank you. I just wanted to ask, is that the darker black silhouette there, is that a gender specific image? I couldn't hear the introduction quickly enough to whether you made reference to that being a black male silhouette or whether it's intentionally unclear what gender that silhouette is.
It's sort of a double portrait. You have the black portion of the, and it's not a cut paper silhouette in this case. It's a silk screen print on top of a lithograph. So you see, kind of gazing to the right, a female face. And in this case, it's a little bit ambiguous. I had read it in my in the museum label copy. We had noted it as a young African-American woman, but we had a scholar come to do a talk, Stephanie Sparling Williams, and she interpreted it as a young white girl. So there is that ambiguity in Kara Walker's work. Sometimes characters are caricatured, so it's impossible to misread them.
Okay.
However, within the silhouette of the female is yet another silhouette of a man gazing to the left. And in that case, I've interpreted it as the silhouette of an African-American man, but I think it's subjective. It's your own interpretation. But in a way, Kara Walker is changing the focus of the work. So we're looking at these two young boys who are loading up a caravan for, I believe, residents of Atlanta who are being ordered to evacuate. But then there's also this element of romance that's often suggested in Kara Walker's work, like Harlequin novel romance. So there's also this sort of perverse suggestion that, you know, perhaps it's a white girl with a black man on her mind, or there's some implications of romance in this work. So there's so many different ways of reading these. Just
okay.
The more conversation.
Right. So the scholars are in agreement that the black silhouette figure, the larger figure, is definitely female. And I asked that because I wasn't sure myself. I thought it might be a child.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
It looks like it looks like a young woman.
Like it could also be a young boy. That's why I wasn't sure, and I was asking.
Interesting,
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a possibility, and nothing is really certain. Nothing is pinned down in her work. You think you've understood it, you speak to somebody who's got a completely different interpretation, and that's what's wonderful about talking about it.
Yeah. I know I think that both Kara Walker and Zadie Smith are celebrating complexity. And we live in kind of a time when things are, unfortunately, thinking of things in terms of black and white and 29 characters or whatever. And we don't have a big attention span, and it's certainly not cultivated in us because information comes to us fast and furious. And I think that both their work really necessitates taking time and living in the messiness and the ambivalence and the lack of clarity, and being comfortable with that, because reminding us that actually that is what life is.
Yeah, I would just add on to that level, my research on Sally Hemings and other historical figures has taught me that, I mean, to see someone in profile is to be confronted with that challenge that had been born out of a race-based slave system, which was that blackness was something people searched for in the face or tried to pin onto people, to identify that there was a great deal of discourse around the spectrum of race as it related to people's subjugation, freedom, ability to pass, to not pass. And I think something that I think is compelling about Kara Walker's work is that sometimes the figures are clear in their racial markings because of the caricature, but sometimes they're not. And when they're not, it reminds us of our own impulse to identify and categorize people and to make sense of people based on their facial features, which is something that's part of the colonial mindset we've come to absorb. So I like this piece. I love this this piece I hadn't looked so closely at it, and I really appreciate the opportunity to do so, because it as you said, it doesn't get any clearer.
Yeah. And in a way, racism is the ultimate example of simplistic thinking. It's absolutely the opposite of complexity.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And this piece is a perfect example of that. And Lynn, thank you for pointing that out.
Oh, you're welcome, Donna. And I'm just a little bit in shock because a couple of hours ago, I wrote an email to one of our participants and said almost exactly what you just said verbatim, in terms of how wonderful it is that these artists allow for the complexity, the uncontainableness of all of this, and how complex it truly is, and gives us an opportunity to not live in this cut and dried, I hate to say black and white because I'm not intending to make a racial comment, but that, you know what I mean, that there's only a right or a wrong or a yes or a no, when actually real life is very, very messy.
Right. And there's a humility in that, which I think leads to compassion, as opposed to when you see things black and white or in a binary way and simplistically, there's an arrogance. And from that place, there's a lack of compassion. So it's all complex. Professor Williamson, would you have the final word?
No, I'm so enriched by the opportunity to be in conversation. It's incredibly valuable to me, and I really appreciate people's feedback and openness. It takes a lot to approach these topics, but I think it's affirming to be a part of this group and be able to share this time with you all. So thank you so much. And Lisa and Donna, thank you.
Oh my God, I'm going to unmute everybody so we can just applaud.
Bravo.
That was really marvelous. I just want to thank Professor Williamson for that amazing presentation. And I think that we all have a lot to think about. It's going to be the gift that keeps on giving. And to Lisa Williams, thank you so much for the beautiful video, for your comments and your insights, and everybody for participating. It was a marvelous night, and it was wonderful to be with you. And again, lots to think about as we move forward together. But blessings to everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And to
Thank
you.
you so much.
Thank you. Much gratitude.
Wonderful.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
you.
Thank you, Donna. Bye.
Thank you.
And thank you to the
Bye.
Britain Museum of American Art for this wonderful partnership.
Yes.
Thank you. That's great.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.